Sign the papers today, right now at this table. Not until an independent audit happens first. You think you still have that kind of leverage. You're about to burn down everything Dad built, just because you won't bend. I'm not the one holding the match. Last chance, your mother, your keys. If you walk back down this mountain, you end this family. My mother's final words to me on that ridge were meant as a warning. What she failed to understand, standing there with her back already turning, was that I never intended to come down that mountain as the same woman they had left behind in the snow. 3 years is a long time to vanish. It is also exactly long enough to build something nobody sees coming until it's already standing in the room with them. She meant those words as a threat. She never once asked herself what would happen if I actually came back. If stories like this keep you watching, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post a new one every week, and you won't want to miss where this one lands. My father built Callaway heavy equipment, the way men of his generation built almost everything worth keeping. Slowly, with his own 2 hands, without ever asking anyone's permission. He started with a single rented warehouse on the edge of Ironwood Falls, Montana, a town that existed at all because the surrounding mountains were full of copper. The mining operations that came to pull that copper out of the ground needed heavy machinery, and Thomas Callaway made cert they came to him first. By the time I was born, the company had grown into 3 warehouses, a fleet of service trucks, and enough long-term contracts to put every one of his children through college without a single sleepless night over money. My father wasn't a complicated man. He believed you showed up and did the job right the first time, and everything else worked itself out from there. I came back to work alongside him 8 years before he died, turning down offers from 2 firms in Denver and 1 in Chicago, all more impressive on paper than returning home to run numbers next to a man who still tracked invoices in a paper binder. But my father had built something real, and I understood a piece of it he never quite let himself see. The business was healthy, but fragile in the exact way anything is fragile when it's built entirely around one person's judgment. He knew every customer by name and handled every major contract with a handshake. If he were ever gone, nothing would hold the structure together except loyalty and habit, and neither survives long once real pressure hits. So I came home. I spent my first year learning the operation from the inside out, every supplier relationship, every contract, every clause. What I found was a business coasting on goodwill far longer than it should have. My father charged less than the market would have supported, trusted more than the numbers justified, and hadn't renegotiated a supplier rate in 12 years. I didn't change any of it overnight. I built new systems slowly and let results speak instead of opinions. Within 6 years, revenue had nearly tripled. We landed new enterprise clients, restructured logistics, and rewrote supplier agreements that finally matched the market. My father was proud in his quiet way. He never said it outright, but somewhere around year 3, he simply stopped questioning my decisions. My older brother Grant noticed the growth too. He drew an entirely different conclusion from it. Grant had always assumed the company would eventually be his, not because he'd earned it, but because he was the eldest son, and in his mind that required no further explanation. He'd worked at Callaway since he was 22, mostly in operations and account management, competent in the narrow way people are competent when they've never had to compete for anything. He could run a meeting and charm a client over dinner. He could not read a balance sheet with any precision, and had no instinct for the structural decisions that actually kept a company alive. He knew this about himself, somewhere underneath everything, even if he'd never say it aloud. What he felt toward me, I think, was something he'd trained himself to call concern for the family, when really it was just the old fear of watching someone else become everything he assumed he already was. My sister Renata handled the company's finances, and had for years. She was sharp and controlled, always with a tidy explanation for any number that needed one. My father trusted her without reservation. I trusted her less the longer I watched her work, though for a long time I couldn't point to anything specific, just a smoothness to her presentations that always moved a beat faster than the data could justify. Our uncle Silas ran warehouse operations and logistics, treating his position as something closer to an inherited title than a job. He sourced vendors and managed every hauling contract, understanding the physical. side of the operation better than anyone alive. He was also the kind of man who had spent decades finding ways to make his own interests line up with his professional decisions, and had gotten very good at making sure none of it could be easily traced. My father died on a Tuesday. Heart attack, fast, no warning. I was negotiating a service agreement with one of our largest mining clients when Grant called, and I drove 3 hours straight back to Ironwood Falls with my hands locked on the wheel. By the time the funeral was arranged, the internal dynamics of the company had already shifted in ways I hadn't fully registered yet. My mother, Diane, became the ceremonial head of the family and assumed a board seat that was largely symbolic, though she treated it as absolute authority from the first meeting. Grant stepped into operational leadership as though he'd been standing in that spot his whole life. And I kept doing the work, the client relationships, the strategic contracts, the supplier negotiations, because it still needed doing, and because I was still the only one who knew how. For almost 2 years, I told myself the discomfort I felt was grief wearing a strange disguise. I told myself Grant's decisions didn't make sense because he was still learning. I told myself Renata's numbers took 3 conversations to understand because that was just her style. I was wrong about all of it. And the cruelty of being wrong that way is that you resist the evidence far longer than you should, because the alternative, understanding that people you love have been quietly stealing from you, is a door you don't want to open until you no longer have a choice. The discovery happened the way most real discoveries happen, not in one dramatic instant, but in a slow accumulation of small moments that eventually stopped leaving room for innocent explanations. I was preparing a financial summary for a potential client when something in the vendor payment records didn't line up with what I knew about our operating costs. The gap wasn't dramatic, the kind that could be explained by a timing difference. But I'd been living inside these numbers long enough to know this one didn't have an innocent explanation waiting behind it. So I kept pulling threads. Over 3 weeks, I found that Callaway Heavy Equipment was carrying debt far larger than anything reflected in the internal reports I had clearance to see. Several of our largest vendor payments flowed to companies that, once I traced their filings, connected directly back to Sila's. The rates those vendors charged sat well above market. Renata had routed the payments through a layered sub-account structure clean enough to sail past every internal review without tripping a single flag. Grant had known. Worse, he'd been using the doctored financials to justify taking out a new secured loan against our main production facility, a loan that would generate a huge cash infusion, one large enough to mask the ongoing drain for at least another 2 years. The loan required signatures from every major shareholder. My father had left me a meaningful stake, which meant they needed me at that table, whether they liked it or not. Grant called a family meeting. He presented the loan as a bold, necessary move, an opportunity to expand and finally secure the company's future. Renata's materials made the financial picture look entirely manageable. Silas sat at the far end and said almost nothing, which was exactly how he operated when something important was actually being decided. My mother sat at the head of the table, in the chair my father used to occupy, watching me the way she always watched me when she expected compliance. I told them I wouldn't sign, not without a full independent audit of the company's real position before another dollar of debt was added. I said it plainly, without accusation, because I still didn't want to say out loud what I already believed. If the company's position was as manageable as they claimed, I told them, an audit would only confirm it. The room went very still. Grant said he was only trying to take control of something that had never really been mine to control. He said it with the rehearsed weight of a man who'd built that sentence long before this conversation. Renata gave me the tight, careful look she always gave me when she wanted to believe I was simply being difficult. My mother said the thing she always said when she needed the family to close ranks. Family protects family. She said it like a law of nature, as though she hadn't noticed the protection only ever flowed in one direction. For the first time in my life, I said clearly, in that room, that protecting family did not mean helping family steal. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. I had named the thing sitting in the middle of the table, and once it was named, we all understood that nothing that had felt possible before that sentence was possible any lun. R. The invitation to Wolfhead Range came from my mother 2 weeks later, framed exactly the way she always framed our annual winter trip, a family tradition, a gesture toward my father's memory. He had taken us into those mountains every winter of our childhood, loving the specific silence above the treeline. He had scattered his own father's ashes near a pass called Widow's Notch, and had said once, half joking, that he'd want the same done for him. We did exactly that after his funeral. My mother said she wanted the family to find its way back to one another before the anniversary of his death. I didn't want to go. I went anyway, because some stubborn part of me still believed in a version of this family the trip was supposed to represent, and because I thought distance from the office might allow a conversation none of us had managed in Ironwood Falls. I was wrong about that too. We stayed at the old family cabin near Widow's Notch, a structure my father had maintained with the same quiet insistence he brought to everything, not beautiful, but built to last. The first day was civil. We cooked together, avoided every subject that mattered, and spoke in the hollow register of people who have silently agreed to pretend. By Saturday morning, the pretending had run out of road. Grant brought the loan documents on the hike. We were climbing toward the overlook, the same spot where my father's ashes had been scattered, the same path we'd walked 2 years earlier. Grant stopped and pulled the folder from his pack. He held it out, told me this was my last chance to handle it cleanly before it became something none of us could contain. He said it with the calm patience of a man who had already decided what would happen next. I said no. I told him that once I returned to Ironwood Falls, I'd contact an independent auditor and a corporate attorney, and whatever they found would decide both the loan's fate and my continued involvement in the company. I said it knowing exactly what it meant. Some part of me still believed there were lines they would never cross. I had known these people my entire life. When I turned to start back down, my boot slipped on icy rock. My ankle twisted violently, and I went down hard, unable to put any weight on the foot. I reached for a handhold and looked toward Grant because he was closest. He reached for my pack instead. He lifted it off my shoulder, not roughly but with a slow, deliberate calm that felt worse than roughness, and set it aside. Renata was already reaching into my jacket pocket, where she'd watched me tuck my phone that morning. She took it without a word. Sila's had been standing slightly apart, and now he stepped forward and picked my keys up off the ground where they'd fallen. I told myself they were making a point, a demonstration, a moment engineered to show me how isolated I was, how completely I depended on their cooperation to get off that mountain. I told myself this because the alternative, the thing actually unfolding, was not something I was ready to understand. They turned and started back down. I called after them, Grant's name first, then Renata's, then Silas's. Not one of them slowed. My mother had been standing 10 feet behind me the entire time. I turned to her with the desperate hope of someone who still believes one person in the room has a limit. I asked her to call for help, to wait. I told her my ankle was badly injured, the temperature already dropping, weather rolling in from the northwest. I could see it in how the sky had changed over the past hour. I asked her not to leave me there. She stood still for a long moment, looking at me the way she never had before, not unkind, exactly, but settled, as though she'd already finished whatever internal reckoning she needed, and all that remained was the physical act of walking away. She said that if I came back down that mountain, I would destroy the family. Then she turned and followed the others down the slope. I understood then, with the clarity that only arrives once every gentler interpretation is used up, that this had never been a demonstration. They had calculated that the cold and the darkness would solve the problem I'd become, and decided that outcome was acceptable. And then they simply walked away and let it happen. The storm hit faster than I expected. No phone, no pack, no weight on my left foot, and the temperature dropping in sudden staggered steps, each colder than the last. I moved the only way I still could, angling down off the exposed trail into cover below the pass. It took hours to reach an old forestry outpost I barely remembered from years earlier, abandoned, half-collapsed, but with enough wall and roof left to cut the worst of the wind. I stayed there nearly 2 full days. When a geological survey crew found the outpost, I was deep in severe hypothermia, unable to stand without support. They called an ambulance and stayed until it arrived. Police contacted my family. Grant. T told them I'd grown upset on the hike, argued with the group, and walked off alone, that they'd searched but couldn't find me, and assumed I'd made my own way down. There were no cameras on that trail, no independent witnesses, nothing that would ever let a prosecutor prove what had actually happened. I spent 4 days in the hospital. My ankle required surgery. My core temperature had dropped low enough in the first day to genuinely alarm the doctors. On the fourth day, I checked myself out, drove to a hotel in a town I'd never set foot in, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I thought about walking into a police station with my own account. I thought about hiring an attorney and dragging the records into open court. I thought about confronting all three of them face to face. But I had been on that mountain. I had called my mother's name and watched her walk away anyway. I understood now, completely, exactly what my family was willing to do to protect what they'd built. And I understood something else, that going back to reclaim my old position wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was something they hadn't thought to defend against, because it demanded more patience and precision than anything they'd ever built themselves. I didn't want to reclaim my place inside their company. I wanted to own it. I drove out of Montana on a Tuesday morning in November with 2 duffel bags, a laptop, and enough cash for roughly 3 months. I told no one where I was headed and filed no forwarding address. A friend from graduate school had offered me her spare room in a small Oregon town called Briarfield, and that was the entire plan. The first thing I did was sleep for 2 days. The second was write out, in as much detail as I could pull from memory, everything I'd uncovered in the Callaway records before I lost access for good. I wrote it longhand on a legal pad, because I no longer trusted any device I'd used inside that company. I wanted a record. I wanted to understand precisely what I was holding. Then I set the legal pad aside and started building something new. Northline Procurement Group began as a single rented room with 2 people, myself, and a logistics analyst named Priya Anand, who'd worked under me at Callaway for 4 years and followed me to Oregon without asking for much explanation beyond the one I gave. That the situation had become untenable, and that if she was willing to gamble on starting over, I believed we could build something worth the risk. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The third desk sat empty for 7 months before we could afford to fill it. What Northline did in those early months was fundamentally the same work I'd always done, just without an established name behind it. We helped mid-sized companies untangle supply chains, cut vendor costs, renegotiate contracts drifting above market rate, and in a few cases restructure entire procurement operations well enough to steer clear of insolvency. I had no reputation in Oregon, and a track record I couldn't fully discuss. What I had was the ability to walk into a room, glance at a company's numbers, and see the actual problem faster than anyone else at the table. That was enough to land the first client. That client's results landed the second. The second brought 2 more within 6 months. Reputation in procurement is slow to build and nearly impossible to fake. A renegotiated contract either holds under pressure or collapses the first time something goes wrong. There's no version of that work where a good presentation substitutes for competence, which is exactly why I'd always felt at home in it. By the end of the first year, Northline had 6 active clients and a small, steady team. By the end of the second, we'd moved into a real office, hired 3 more people, and landed our first true enterprise contract, a regional construction firm needing its materials sourcing rebuilt ahead of a major expansion. That single contract generated more revenue than our entire first year combined. I didn't spend those 2 years thinking about Callaway with any regularity. That isn't entirely honest. There were evenings I thought about it more than I wanted to, moments in client meetings when a set of numbers would remind me of a pattern I'd seen in Renata's reports, and I'd have to redirect my attention. But I'd made a deliberate choice not to monitor the company. Checking in, even passively, felt like a quiet refusal to actually let it go. So I let it go, or tried to, and poured everything into what stood in front of me. It was my attorney, Walter Finch, who eventually brought Callaway back into view. Walter had handled Northline's legal work since our second year, a quiet, precise man who'd learned never to waste words in front of me. He called on a Wednesday and asked if I had half an hour. I said yes, and he arrived with a single folder, which he set on my desk without preamble. He explained that a regional bank was show peeping a distressed debt position, a large secured loan that had slipped into technical default after the borrower breached multiple covenants over 18 months. The company was Callaway Heavy Equipment. The loan was secured against the main production facility. Without outside capital, the company would lose control of its primary asset within months, and bankruptcy reorganization was almost certainly the next stop. I looked at that folder a long time before opening it. I was aware of what I was feeling, and aware that it wasn't a useful guide for what to do next. So I asked Walter how it had landed on his desk. He explained the bank had approached a boutique investment firm he worked with, hunting for buyers who understood the industrial equipment sector. He'd flagged it because he knew part of my history, and because he genuinely believed there was real recoverable value beneath whatever leadership had done to the balance sheet. I asked for a week before we discussed it further. Then I opened the folder. What the independent audit showed, once Walter commissioned it through a third party, was exactly what I expected, plus something I hadn't quite anticipated. The expected part: the company was in genuinely serious trouble. Grant had taken on debt at a pace that only made sense if the growth I'd built simply continued forever, which it hadn't, because the clients who'd driven that growth started leaving within 8 months of my departure. The facility was undermaintained. Key supplier relationships had deteriorated. 2 enterprise accounts I'd personally secured had already left for competitors. The part I hadn't fully anticipated: the bones of the company were still solid. The technical staff my father had built over 3 decades was largely intact. The equipment inventory, though poorly managed, still carried real market value. The regional supplier network still existed because those relationships were structural, built into geography and history in ways that don't evaporate just because Grant stopped tending to them. What I was looking at was a company damaged by its leadership, not by its market. A different kind of problem, and a far more solvable one. I told Walter I wanted to move forward, and exactly how. We built a holding company at a careful distance from Northline, structured with multiple intermediary layers, legally sound, none of it designed to hide anything from regulators, but organized so it wouldn't immediately reveal the identity of the ultimate owner to anyone running a routine search. What I wanted was time, enough to finish the acquisition before Grant, Renata, or Silas realized who was on the other side. Through the holding structure, we purchased the distressed debt from the bank below its stated value. The bank accepted because the alternative was a long default process with murky recovery odds. We then approached 2 minority shareholders who'd known my father and watched the company collapse under Grant, and bought their stakes at a fair price with almost no persuasion needed. By the time it was finished, the holding company controlled enough debt and equity combined to determine the outcome of any restructuring. My family had no idea any of it was happening. They assumed the investor was some distant institution concerned purely with returns, not with the specific internal history of the company. 3 weeks into due diligence, I found the second layer of what my family had done. Reviewing archived internal communications obtained as part of the debt purchase documentation, I found that after the night on Widow's Notch, Grant had told key clients and partners I'd suffered a serious mental health crisis and left abruptly. Not to explain my absence, to preemptively discredit any account I might one day give. He'd told people I'd become unstable, that the company was better off now that things had stabilized. He had also taken personal credit, in internal presentations and at industry events, for 3 major client contracts I had personally negotiated. And I found something more deliberate than either of those things. Renata had reclassified a series of expense entries, costs tied directly to the vendor fraud scheme she and Silas were running, recording them as originating from my former division, dated to periods when I was still nominally part of the company. Designed to look, to anyone reviewing the record later, as though the irregularities had started in my division rather than theirs. They hadn't simply left me on a mountain and hoped I wouldn't make it back. They had spent months afterward making sure that if I did, no one would believe a word I said. I read those documents alone on a Saturday evening, sat with it long enough to fully understand it, then went home, cooked dinner, and forced myself to sleep. I'd learned that decisions made in the raw heat of feeling something are almost always worse than ones made after the feeling has been acknowledged and see. T aside. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to do it correctly, not quickly. Grant hadn't been idle. He spent weeks chasing alternative capital, 3 private lenders, and a regional investment group, none of whom moved forward once they reviewed the company's true position. Renata spent that stretch softening internal reports. Silas, his concern shifting from extraction to self-protection, tried moving key contracts into subsidiary structures, a maneuver that, if completed, would have stripped recoverable value before any change in ownership could capture it. Walter flagged Silas's activity almost as soon as it surfaced in the filings and moved to block the transfers through every mechanism available to a secured creditor. The challenge succeeded. Most of what Silas tried to move stayed put. Then, late on a Thursday night, Walter called. While reviewing the holding company's ownership chain, a review Silas's own attorney had initiated, hunting for grounds to challenge our standing, a connection had surfaced. An early investor in the holding entity was held in trust by a business contact whose name also appeared in Callaway's vendor records. The connection was indirect and would take real work to trace, but if Silas's attorney found it before the transaction closed, they could force a delay, and a delay was all they needed to find capital elsewhere. I had less than 12 hours before final execution. Walter had already mapped the path forward. He just needed my authorization. I gave it. We worked through the night, unwinding the connection and restructuring that portion of ownership in a way that was legally airtight and procedurally invisible from the outside. By 6, the exposure was closed. By 8, Walter was driving to Ironwood Falls. At 9 that morning, in the Callaway boardroom, Grant, Renata, Silas, and my mother signed the restructuring agreement. Under its terms, the holding company received 72% ownership in exchange for retiring the majority of the company's debt and supplying working capital to stabilize operations. Grant objected loudly throughout. My mother told him there was no other option. He signed anyway. They all signed. When the final signature landed, Grant asked Walter when he'd finally meet the new owner. Walter checked his watch and told him, "Tomorrow morning, this boardroom, 9 o'clock. Grant nodded as though it were a courtesy, not the last quiet hour of something already over. Then Walter left, and the family sat with what they'd agreed to, not yet understanding what was walking through that door in the morning. I drove to a hotel in Ironwood Falls that night, and sat for a long while. I thought about my father, about the overlook near Widow's Notch, about the compass he carried on every trip, brass, worn smooth from decades of handling, kept in a small wooden box on my desk in Briarfield for 3 years. I'd carried it out of the mountains the night the survey team found me, held onto it the way you hold something that represents a question you haven't finished answering. My father had taught me that a compass only points to true north, regardless of where you're standing or how disoriented you feel. It doesn't care about your circumstances, only direction. I'd needed that lesson in the years since. I suspected I'd need it again in the morning. I arrived at the Callaway building at 8:45. I sat in the parking lot a few minutes, not from hesitation, but because I wanted to look at the building before walking back inside. I hadn't been back since the hospital. It looked exactly as I remembered, the same gray facade, the same raised letters, the same row of service vehicles my father bought one at a time over 20 years. From the street you couldn't tell how close to the edge it had come. Walter was waiting at the entrance. We walked in together. The receptionist recognized him and started the standard greeting before her eyes landed on me, and whatever she saw in my face stopped her mid-sentence. I smiled at her, and we kept walking toward the boardroom. Through the glass panel I could see them all seated, Grant at the head, Renata to his left, Silas at the far end, my mother positioned close enough to the center of power to feel authoritative without technically being in charge. Senior managers, a bank representative, an attorney I didn't recognize, all talking quietly, waiting for something they still believed they could manage. Walter opened the door and walked in first. The conversation went silent. Every face turned toward the doorway, expecting a stranger. I walked in behind him and watched recognition move across the room. Grant's expression cycled through something before settling into a stillness I recognized as the precursor to something loud. Renata's pen hit the table before she registered dropping it. Silas's face went carefully blank. My mother stood up out of her chair, something she almost never did for anyone. And the involuntary nature of it told me everything about the state she was suddenly in. I walked to the head of the table. Grant didn't move at first, waiting for an instinct that wasn't arriving fast enough. Finally he stood. I sat down in his place. "What are you doing here?" Grant said, his voice straining to sound controlled. Walter opened his case and laid out the documentation. How Northline and its holding entities had, through legally executed transactions, acquired 72% of Callaway Heavy Equipment through the distressed debt purchase and the minority equity acquisition. The beneficial owner of the controlling interest was me. Effective immediately, I held operational authority, superseding the existing management structure. The room absorbed it differently depending on where each person sat. The bank representative showed no reaction. None of this was news to him. The senior managers exchanged a look mostly of confusion laced with relief. Grant started stringing together words like conspiracy and theft, the way people do when the words matter less than filling the silence. Renata said nothing. Silas sat with his arms crossed, and I understood he'd already calculated the odds of exactly this scenario, which was why he'd tried to move those contracts. He'd been right about the possibility and wrong about stopping it. I let Walter finish before I said anything. Then I told the senior managers that nothing about daily operations would change that morning, that their teams should continue on normal schedules, that no personnel decisions beyond today's would be made without proper process, and that my first priority was stabilizing the company, not disrupting it. Then I told them, and the bank representative, they were free to leave. The room contracted down to just my family, Walter and me. Grant's removal from the CEO role took effect immediately, exactly as stipulated in the agreement he'd signed the previous day without fully understanding what it meant. Renata was suspended pending a comprehensive audit reaching back 5 years. Silas was barred from every financial system, vendor account, and supplier contract until that audit was complete. My mother retained her board seat, but nowhere near enough voting shares to influence anything without my consent. Grant told me I had stolen the company, with the specific conviction of a man who's finally landed on a framing he finds satisfying. I told him I had purchased a controlling interest in a company its own leadership drove to the edge of insolvency, through transactions that were entirely legal, fully documented, and transparent to every regulator with jurisdiction over them. I told him if he wanted to contest the ownership in court, he was entitled to, and Walter would provide his attorney with everything relevant. I said all of it without raising my voice, because there was no version of this conversation where volume would accomplish anything, and because I'd spent 3 years learning that composure isn't the absence of feeling. It's the decision not to let feeling dictate the outcome. Grant stood and walked out, Silas trailing behind him. Renata left without looking at me. My mother stayed seated, hands folded, staring at the table instead of at me. Walter gathered his documents and left us alone. My mother spoke first. She told me she'd never planned what happened on that mountain, not that it hadn't happened, but that she hadn't planned it. What she meant, though she never said it this way, was that she'd arrived there through a series of smaller decisions that each seemed manageable at the time. Letting Grant handle my objections. Coming along on the hike when some part of her must have understood what he intended. And standing on that trail, saying exactly what she said, and turning away. She hadn't planned it. She had permitted it, which is a different kind of responsibility, and in some ways heavier, because permission requires a moment of full awareness that pure planning never does. She said she'd only been trying to save what my father built. I told her what I'd come to understand as simply true, that my father had built a company, and she'd sacrificed her own daughter trying to protect the people destroying it. I said it without anger, because I'd run out of anger somewhere around the 2nd year after that mountain. What remained was quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly, but an accurate understanding of what had happened, and why, a different thing entirely, and I think a far more durable one. She asked me not to pursue the family further, legally, criminally, the audit, the files Walter was already preparing to hand over. I told her that whatever the audit found would go where it was supposed to go, because I wasn't willing to do for her now what I'd been asked to do 3 years earlier: protect the people responsible from the consequences of their own choices. I wasn't in that room to punish her. I also wasn't there to shield her. I was there because the company was mine now, and this conversation needed to happen before I could move forward cleanly. She looked at me then, directly, for the first time since I'd walked back into that building. Something in her expression I'd never seen before, the look of someone who's reached the end of one version of herself and doesn't yet know what comes next. I took out the small wooden box I'd carried from Briarfield. Inside sat my father's compass, brass, worn smooth, its needle still perfectly calibrated. I set it on the table and opened it. I told her my father had taught me something with that compass, back when I was young enough to think being lost was a catastrophe rather than a condition with a solution. When you don't know where you are, the compass doesn't care about your circumstances. It only points to true north, and from there you figure out the rest yourself. What I'd taken from that lesson, over the years, was something larger. Direction is something you find for yourself. The people you follow are only as reliable as the choices they actually make when the pressure is real. When you're lost, I told her, you don't keep following the people who led you the wrong way. You find your own direction. Then I left the room. The audit took 11 weeks and confirmed what the records had already suggested, that the problems ran deeper than any one person's decisions, and the documentation was sufficient for the legal authorities to proceed however they saw fit. I submitted everything and stepped back completely. It was no longer mine to manage. What I focused on instead was the company. I spoke to the employees 2 days after the acquisition closed. Roughly 120 people gathered, most having spent the past year under rising uncertainty. I didn't give a speech about vision. I told them the truth, honest without being more detailed than necessary. The problems were never the result of their work. The problems were decisions made above them, by people who were now gone. And I told them the thing I most wanted them to understand. You were never the problem. One floor supervisor, with the company since my father's earliest days, started clapping when I finished. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of acknowledgement people offer when they recognize something genuine, and it spread across the room in a way I found, despite everything, difficult to receive without feeling it land. Priya flew in from Briarfield the following week to help stabilize Northline's Oregon operations remotely, holding that side together with the same steadiness she'd brought since day one, freeing me to focus entirely on rebuilding here. Grant lost the CEO title and faced personal liability exposure. His attorney was still managing the last I checked. Renata reached a settlement I was never party to. Silas's vendor contracts were terminated, and the investigation into his conduct proceeded through channels no longer my responsibility. My mother kept her nominal board seat, which meant nothing in practical terms, and I never saw her again in any professional setting. 1 year after the acquisition closed, the company returned to profitability. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way real financial health arrives once the structural rot is addressed and the work is finally allowed to produce results on its own. Walter and I renamed the company. We called it Ridgeline Callaway Industries, a name connecting the work to the geography and to what I'd built in Oregon, without requiring any explanation tied to the history underneath the old one. My father's name wasn't on the new sign. His actual values, the ones I'd watched him practice, the ones I'd tried to carry through everything that followed, lived in the structure of the company itself, in how we treated suppliers, kept commitments, and made decisions that could hold up under real examination. That felt like a far more accurate inheritance than a name bolted above a door. In the autumn after the company turned profitable, I drove back to Wolfhead Range, alone, on a clear day when the forecast was certain, and took the trail up to Widow's Notch. The same trail, the same overlook. I stood at the exact place where I had fallen and called after people who had already decided to leave. The mountains looked the same. The view held its own silence in the specific way only altitude can, where the wind moves and nothing beneath it responds. I stayed a long time. 3 years earlier, I had lain in the snow on this mountain and understood exactly what my family was capable of. Standing here now, I understood something else. The worst thing they had done was never leaving me here. The worst thing was that they had believed, with complete confidence, that I would not survive it. And the reason that still matters, standing here in the clean autumn cold, is that their confidence showed me, precisely and without ambiguity, exactly who I actually was. Not who they'd always assumed I was. Not who I'd tried to be for their benefit. Who I was when there was nothing left in front of me but the choice to keep moving or stop. I had kept moving. I had built something they could never take from me. And then I had gone back and bought the very thing they thought they were protecting. And none of it had required me to become anyone other than exactly who I already was. I turned away from the overlook and started back down the mountain. The trail was clear. I knew exactly where I was going. There's one thing I want to leave you with before this story ends. The people who try to diminish you, who take your phone, your keys, your seat at the table, your name out of the record, they are counting on exactly one thing, that you will simply stay gone. They are counting on the cold to finish what they started. What I understood at the bottom of that mountain was that the most powerful response was never revenge. It was return, on your own terms, built with your own hands, in your own time. If a story like this means something to you, you already know why. Subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is simply remind them, you are not finished yet.